Hello, everyone. Welcome to day one of LMS week. My name is Kelly Adey. I'm Schoology's Director of Instructional Strategy. And here at Schoology, we know that adopting anything that involves learning and technology can be a big deal, but it's especially a big deal when it's something like a learning management system or an LMS. So that's why we're hosting 5 straight days of insightful discussion with different subject matter experts. Each session will dive into key stages of the LMS journey, from vision setting and strategy building to evaluating, choosing, implementing, and transforming learning with LMSs. Our jam-packed schedule has something for everyone. So if you haven't signed up for any of the sessions, I encourage you to revisit our landing page at schoology.com/LMS-week and see what we've got planned. If you have not attended one of our webinars before, you should see over on the right-hand side for you an area that is dedicated for chat. So as our session goes on today, if you have questions, then go ahead and post them there. We have some moderators that will be taking a look at those. Obviously, with a lot of people, it gets hard to manage all of them at once, but we'll try to pull out ones that are key, and we have basically an area at the end designed just for questions. And the other thing that we will be doing is we'll be posting some of our kind of relevant areas or things that we want to share with you in terms of links or whatever in that space as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. As I said, we'll be looking at our different phases of adopting LMS this week. So today, David Wallace, an instructional coach at Fairbanks Local School District in Ohio, he and I will be discussing vision setting and what it means for positioning your EdTech strategy and your district up for long-term success. Tuesday is going to explore what you need to know about a modern LMS. Wednesday, we'll look into the key considerations and questions you should ask before you select an LMS. Thursday is all about implementation. And Friday, we finish with 4 practitioners. We're going to share their tips on leveraging the LMS to really enhance learning. Again, you can learn more about all of this at schoology.com/LMS-week. Also want to note that after the webinar, we will be sending out a short feedback survey so you can tell us what you thought about the content. So look for that in your email. And finally, you'll want to follow along with LMS Week on Twitter using the hashtag LMS Week. So please use that and tweet to @Schoology and let us know you're out there. I just put a link for the audience there for that landing page. So if you're interested in signing up for some of our other sessions this week, that's where you would do so. So as we mentioned today, our focus is going to be on how do you really set up your EdTech strategy for long-term success. And so what we're going to do is David Wallace and he and I are hosting today. We're going to actually give you a little bit of background on each of us as we present, and then we'll dive into some things to think about before you actually choose an LMS. As I said, I'm Kelly Adey. I'm the Director of Instructional Strategy, and I joined Schoology in 2016 after I pseudo-retired after 25 years in public education, all in the state of Colorado. So I spent the first half of my career as a high school English teacher in Denver Public Schools. And the second half of my career, I spent in a district called Cherry Creek Schools, where I was a district technology coordinator and also a building tech coordinator before that. But when I was in that role at the district level, part of what I had to do and what I was responsible for was rolling out major technology initiatives. And one of those happened to be implementing a new LMS. And we happened to switch in my district from a previous LMS to Schoology. So I kind of looked at it from that perspective of not only like setting up a new LMS, but also I have experience in like what does it mean to actually make that transition. David Wallace, as I said, is a 612 instructional coach from Fairbanks Local School District, not Fairbanks, Alaska. It's actually in the state of Ohio. And I'll let David introduce himself when we actually get to his section of the webinar today. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about really what it takes to really set that foundation. And that really involves 2 key areas. One is understanding that change process, and the other is making sure that you establish a shared vision. And we'll be talking about kind of some of the research about how to do that effectively, relying very heavily on some work that's been done by Learning Forward. And after we talk about sort of those high level, theoretical things about change and vision, we're going to turn it over to David, and he's going to talk about his experience in his particular district and what they learned about the importance of building an instructional target. We'll have some key takeaways and resources to share with you. And then, as I said, we will have a bit of a time devoted for Q&A at the very end. All right, so let's go ahead and start with setting the foundation and talking specifically about change and vision. And why would we start with those two particular things? Hall and Hoare did some research. The original research was actually back in 2002, but it was updated in 2015. And they published a book called Implementing Change: Patterns, Potholes, and Principles. And one of the things that they kind of gathered through their research was that there are 6 strategies that really impact learning that need to keep in mind when you're rolling out any kind of initiative. So strategy 1 is creating a context that's conducive to change. And strategy 2 is creating that shared vision of change. And what does that look like when it's ideally implemented? Investing in professional learning is strategy 3. Strategy 4 is planning for implementation and allocating resources. Strategy 5, monitoring progress. And strategy 6, providing ongoing support. Our focus today is going to be on those first 2 strategies. And then as the week goes on, you'll be hearing more about some of those other things that are so necessary when you are doing something like implementing an LMS. So the first thing we're going to start with is that context conducive to change. And I want to share specifically something called the concerns-based adoption model. You might hear it referred to as CBAM. But what CBAM is, it's basically a construct that looks at 3 different dimensions of change. And what I really like about CBAM is that the CBAM kind of construct came out of research that was specific to education and what happens when we want to impact learning with professional learning. So, there's a lot of change management, strategies out there. As I said, this one I think is very powerful because it does rely on what happens in the K-12 space. So these 3 areas, these 3 dimensions of change that CBAM dives into is describing the innovation so that people understand exactly what it is we're trying to do, identifying attitudes and beliefs of individuals, because as we know, change is a very, very personal process, and it's very important to understand where people might be coming from as they undergo that change. And then the third dimension is depicting what individual behaviors look like as that change occurs. And then you'll see in that center area, you've got the evidence of implementation and then your data that you use to then drive your actions as you go through that process. So the first area, the innovation configuration mapping, that's that description of innovation. The important thing about this particular stage of change is that you give people a very, very clear map about where they're heading. Because a lot of people, if you introduce something that's new, won't know exactly what it should look like when it's really working well. So it's important to kind of lay that groundwork and that framework for them at the very beginning. So I have some notes on here about what that innovation configuration process kind of looks like and what it really is intended to do. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to also put the link to the website where we got this info for you in the chat area. So that if you want to check out that resource on your own, you're welcome to. It's a really great website for looking specifically at CBAM. So when we're talking about, that innovation configuration map, what does that really look like and what does that process look like? So the process is actually pretty simple. It involves a lot of brainstorming, and specifically with a core project team, to think about what are the major parts or components of that new program that you want to roll out. In this case, we're talking about LMSs. And then within each of those parts or components, think about what those ideal behaviors look like for your different major stakeholders. So that could be principals, it could be teachers, could be students. And if we're talking about an LMS, it could even be parents. After you've identified what the kind of ideal behavior looks like, the next thing to think about is, okay, what is non-behavior behavior, not non-ideal behavior look like for those same key individuals? Because what we're really doing here is we want to figure out what looks like a rubric. And I have a sample of it on this slide of what a completed one would look like for teachers in this example. But one thing that you'll notice is that an IC map, or an innovation configuration map, has different levels. I happen to have 4 levels represented here, but that doesn't mean that there's only 4 levels represented on your IC map. When you're going through this process, you may have some of these desired outcomes that have 6 levels. It depends on how many levels of gradation you have between your ideal state and your non-ideal state. But in the example that I have here, which is on the desired outcome, that is to use tools to collaboratively plan an authentic learning experience in digital or virtual spaces, and engage with experts, teams, or students. On the far right, level 4, that's where we put the part where someone is not yet implementing. They are not yet innovating in that particular outcome. And I think that what takes people a little bit of getting used to and looking at an IC map is that it's almost inverse for what you'd expect to see for a rubric. Because notice level 1 is actually your ideal behavior. Level 4 is your non-ideal behavior. So it kind of goes in reverse order. I kind of think about it like steps, where if you're at the very, very top step, you're at the top level, that's level 1. Where if you're not quite there yet and you're going up steps, then that's how you progress from level 4 to level 3 to level 2. So in here, we've got basically gradations of not yet collaborating virtually to using some, kind of expected tools, email, other communication tools with the team or PLC. And then a step up from that would be actually using real-time collaboration tools, maybe something like Google Docs or something like Office 365 in a dedicated space to engage with experts and teams or PLCs. And notice what differentiates the ideal behavior for level 1 is that now we bring in not just local spaces, but global virtual spaces, and also students have been included in that descriptor. So when you're starting off with something like implementing an LMS, you want to think about what do you really want to see happening with leadership, with teachers, with students, and with parents, and really kind of go through a process to figure out what does it look like when that's in its ideal state. So that's IC mapping. The second area to think about is stages of concern. And as I said, change is a very, very personal process. And one of the things I really like about CBAM is that it basically identifies different places where people will land as we're starting, something that is new for them. And I think the key thing about the stages of concern is that it keeps the personal aspect of change as part of your process. And it's a constant check for where we may have to add some additional resources for where people may get stuck or may need some help moving past. Sample statements for stages of concern. If you're in the awareness stage, you might hear somebody say something like this. I think I've heard something about this, but you know what? I'm too busy right now. I've got other stuff going on. I'm not really going to worry about it at this point. So that would be basically, they're in an awareness stage maybe, but that's about it. Once they move into the informational stage, it gets into, oh, this is interesting. I'd like to know more about this. And then this is actually the area, the next stage, where a lot of people end up getting stuck or getting heightened anxiety is, what does this mean for me? This thing's coming down the road. What kind of changes is that going to force me to make? And am I comfortable making those? And then the next one for management is, okay, how do I balance this with other things I'm already doing? How much time is this going to take? What am I going to have to give up and switch around in the way that I'm already doing things and doing them well? The next stage is consequence. How does this affect students? And this is the stage we really want to get people to, because our big focus is always to impact learning. It's always to impact student achievement. So we want to get people past the personal management area into really, what are we doing this for? We're doing this for kids. The next stage is collaboration, and that's when people start to think about, I'd like to actually share some ideas with other people, or maybe ask other people what they're doing and see if we can work together. And then finally, the refocusing stage, that top stage of the stages of concern is, I think I've got some ideas on how this could work even better. So one of the things you can use a stages of concern process for is really thinking about how you communicate your initiative. So we have some recommended processes here at Schoology when we work with districts who are rolling out an LMS, and it has to do with tying your communication strategy to what stage of concern people might be in, and making sure that you're making that something that's appropriate for that stage. Because if you share other ideas, you know, something kind of lofty with people, and they're only in the awareness or informational stage, it's going to be a miss. So this helps you really kind of map out what you want to do with communication, which, as we know, is super critical with making any kind of a change. Okay, moving on to levels of use. This is the part of the dimension of change that depicts individual behaviors. And it actually breaks it down into these different levels that are identified with Roman numerals. But basically, this is you ascertaining, are people actually using it? You know, I'm sure you've heard this question a lot, you know, things like, you know, what impact is this initiative having on student learning? Well, you cannot answer that question if you don't know whether or not people are even using the innovation. Just as an example from my personal background, our district rolled out something called thinking maps. And, you know, the goal, of course, was to really, really impact student learning, giving them these kind of consistent, you know, graphic organizers or concept maps that were attached to different thinking strategies. But we couldn't identify if that was working if we didn't first identify that it was even being used. And that's what this particular area looks at, is are we going to be able to actually identify who our users are and what stage they're in. So for levels of use, if you were looking at this in a strict CBAM kind of approach, and this was research-based, you would do this with a series of interviews. And what you do is you'd have like almost like focus group kind of setups where you go through kind of a branching question technique where you ask people if they're even using it. And then based on their response, yes or no, that changes the direction of your question. And the goal being to figure out where are people really landing with their levels of use. Because once you identify that, you can start to look at, okay, what kind of data can we gather on whether or not this is impacting learning? So the whole goal here of CBAM is to really map out the process you want to have for addressing the change, how you'll help people maneuver through that process, and then how you'll identify or ascertain to what level they're using that as you go through. Now, if we're talking about an LMS, you know, one of the things that we really want to see is we want to see everyone using it. So when you're thinking about identifying levels of use, some districts choose to roll out things in a phased approach, you know, with pilots. You know, that's a perfect time, you know, when you're doing a pilot to start asking these kinds of questions to find out who's using it and how, and what they're really doing with it. Okay, so that's CBAM. Let's look back at our implementation strategies that I identified earlier. So we've got those 6 strategies, and we just spent some time talking about creating a context conducive to change. And again, I use the CBAM model to kind of think about those different dimensions of change. But the next strategy is creating that shared vision of change, especially when it's ideally implemented. So one of the things that we relied on very heavily in my previous district was this NOSTA model for managing complex change. Probably one of my favorite graphics of all time. I'll try to we'll try to upload a file actually of this for those who would like to use this with your own you know, organization or with your own context. But what this really does is it looks at the necessary ingredients for change. Those are at the top row of this table. What the bottom rows then look at is if one of those aspects is missing, what is the result? This is a great tool to share with instructional coaches or those who would be working with people at a building or helping them maneuver through a change, because it helps them listen for these different kinds of reactions to find out where there may have been a misstep. So if you are not clear about the vision for what you're doing, people will be confused. I don't know if anyone's read the work by David Sousa on how the brain learns, but he says there are 2 things that the brain uses to identify whether something goes into long-term storage. Is it relevant? And does it make sense with what I already know? So if a student says to you, why are we learning this? that should be a red flag that they don't understand the relevance of it. Very similar when we're talking about change with adults. If they don't understand why you're doing something, they're going to be confused. Why do we adopt this? Why are we going this direction? So if you hear those questions, setting vision is important. That's why we want to really talk about the importance of that aspect of it today. And that's an area that Dave is going to dive in with more depth in terms of what his experience was at Fairbanks. If people don't feel like they have the skills, they will feel anxiety. If you don't have the correct incentives built in, you might meet with resistance. If people feel like they don't have enough resources, they'll feel frustrated. And in education, that's often, something that is translated with time and with people. So if I don't have time to do this, or I don't feel like I have the people to help me, I might feel frustrated. And finally, if there's no action plan, you might feel like you're on a treadmill. So I've added here a vision setting protocol that was something that was shared from Learning Forward earlier this year. And it was actually part of a handbook that was related to using the language in ESSA to develop some programs and some initiatives that would help on the professional learning side. But I thought it was a great protocol. And I like how it basically goes through some of what we kind of talked about, but defining high quality at instructor and organizational levels. So this might be just asking some open-ended questions or defining, like let's say you've got a blended learning initiative. What does that even look like in the classroom? What does that mean in a school? How would we define that? And the protocol suggests just collecting those publicly somehow. So it might be with sticky notes, it might be with something digital like Padlet, it might be a gallery walk. And then after you collect those, look for things that tend to be common, things that might be themes that are key, and then share those with your stakeholders and get some further feedback and refinement. The second step of that protocol is to develop that clear picture of what that definition looks like in action. So it might be coming up with a chart that conveys kind of like here's what it is and here's what it isn't. And I've seen that a lot with like, here's what personalized learning is and here's what it isn't. That's really kind of what this would do so that people can really understand. And you might even use what you've identified in those innovation configuration maps as ideal, non-ideal to help flesh that out. And then step 3 is clarify how each member of your system is going to contribute to that. Because really, we've got a lot of people that are involved in something like an initiative, like rolling out an LMS. So how is it that your leadership is going to contribute to that? What time do you need to devote to different aspects of that? What about your coaches? What does your culture look like? So really thinking about where all those different moving pieces of your system will help push forward that vision. Because the last thing we want is people asking why. Because if they don't get the why, chances are good they're never going to adopt or move in that direction. And a lot of districts that choose an LMS have different whys for why they do that. And don't forget, later on this week we'll be talking about some of those things you should think about when you want to adopt an LMS, thinking about some of those whys. All right, so now that we've talked about kind of that higher level theoretical kind of aspect of both change and vision setting, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to turn this over to David Wallace so that he can actually go through and talk about his experiences when he was with he's still with Fairbanks and kind of talk through what they saw. David?
Hey everybody, thanks Kelly. That's some excellent information, and I just want to briefly thank everyone for taking the time out of their busy schedules to come out and learn with us today. So I spent 7 years as a social studies teacher in Southwest Ohio in a district called Franklin City Schools. I was fortunate enough to be placed into a computer lab in my 3rd year of teaching and really had the chance to see how using tools like Schoology can really transform what learning looks like for our students. 2 years ago, I started as an instructional coach here at Fairbanks. And I've done a lot of work with our teachers and administrators to try and share some of the great things that I was able to do at Franklin and really see, kind of expand on those things. And when I first came to Fairbanks, we were in a really great position technology-wise. We had one-to-one in a number of classrooms through a series of grants. We had a number of teachers and administrators that did a lot of hard work to make sure that we had a plan in place for rolling out one-to-one in our ninth grade, sixth grade, and then also in our elementary, with a plan in place for how to expand that over the next couple of years. We had done a lot of professional learning with different tools, Schoology, for example, PlayPosit, just different things that would allow teachers to go into their classrooms and have that toolbox at their hands that they could, when there was a specific thing they were trying to do, they had a resource available to them to be able to implement that. And then in 2016, when I was brought on board, along with our curriculum director, we developed our department, the Curriculum and Instructional Technology Department, and we specifically merged our technology and curriculum departments because we wanted to make sure that there was consistent communication between those two pieces. We've heard horror stories of schools that will, the curriculum department will purchase a new resource and the technology department can't support it or won't support it. So we really wanted to make sure that there was a clear and consistent communication between those pieces. And then come winter break 2016, we started to realize that it wasn't just that teachers needed training and really support from administrators on how to use these specific tools, but we needed a broader vision of why we need to use these tools. We really needed to break down and figure out what elements of instruction we felt like would change the learning experience for our students. So we really tried to surface those key points that we wanted teachers to focus on in their classrooms, and then that we've focused on in our professional learning as well. On the left side of this, a couple of key points from Bridges and Bridges. It's a book called Managing Transitions, and they make a clear distinction between change and transition. They refer to change as adding something or removing something. So for example, if you were to switch your email system from Outlook to Gmail, that's a change. If you were to add a new curriculum resource, a new math textbook, that would be a change. Adding an LMS would be a change. But what they focused on was really the transition piece and how it is such an emotional experience, the highs and lows of letting go of things that you've done for years, and then taking on new things and new challenges as you go throughout that process. And they made a couple of key recommendations. And the first one is to recognize the hard work that's been done in the past. And we have a very hardworking staff, great administrators, people who are really committed to advancing what's possible with our students. And we really wanted to make sure that we recognize the work that they had done leading up to this point. We also needed to encourage people that it was okay to let go of certain things. There are things we've done in the past, things that we feel like we are supposed to do that maybe we don't really need to do anymore. And then most importantly for us, and what we focused on probably the most, is what's this all supposed to look like? What's this vision for instruction as we move forward? What's the real goal? If we walk into a classroom, what types of things are we going to see? And then how do we provide professional learning to support that? So those are some key points from Bridges and Bridges. On the right-hand side, you'll see this was an image that I created to kind of help describe what we were about to go through to our teachers and our administrators. And you'll see at the top of that are our district and building mission statements. And again, we wanted to recognize the work that had already been done. So we used that as our starting point for us to develop kind of our motto, our vision for what we want instruction to look like. And then those would be supported by some core values, some things we think are really important, some look-fors, some ways for us to kind of expand on and give context to some of the key things we're looking at, and then obviously the professional development to support it. So this was the process that we used with our teachers, and the first step for us was really to put together a team who would be willing to look at these key changes. And we had a very diverse group. We had representatives from each grade level and each content area, from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. And we were strategic in selecting people who maybe had more experience with blended learning or changing their methods. And then also some people who some might consider more traditional, but were excellent teachers in their own right. And we put this together as kind of an ad hoc committee. We knew that there was a very specific goal and we were going to focus on that goal. And then as soon as we were done, we were going to disband that committee, because we all know that we can all become overwhelmed by the number of committees that exist within schools. So in our first meeting, we really spent a lot of time discussing what the process was going to look like. We went over some key questions, which I'll show you on the next slide, that we would use to help kind of elicit this information out of our staff to determine exactly what it is they saw as the vision for instruction at Fairbanks. And we wanted to make sure that they understood that we were working with them. This wasn't something that was top down, that was prescriptive. We wanted to make sure that our staff and through that committee understood that they were going to play a really important role in coming up with this plan would look like. So we shared the questions and kind of talked through the process a little bit, and then we moved into the second phase. And we posted these questions throughout our district in a number of different offices, and we had teachers come out and respond just on a Post-it note. They could write up a quick response, something that wouldn't take them more than 2 or 3 minutes. And the goal was really to get them reflecting on their current practice and what practice could look like as we move forward. And we had great participation. We did some little incentives to try and drive that participation up a little bit. Our elementary school had the highest participation rate with over 95%. As a district, I think we had close to 300 total responses, and we're a pretty small district with between 60 and 70 teachers. So we had great responses, great feedback from our teachers, and it allowed the committee then in the second meeting, the third step of our process, to come back together and really start sorting through those responses. And we split the committee up into 5 smaller groups, and each group took one of the 5 questions, and they really looked for trends that were showing up in the responses, but not only trends, because sometimes we have outliers, those teachers who are pushing the boundaries a little bit, and they've got some great responses, but it may only show up once, but it might be something that we really need to consider. So it wasn't just about the frequency that something showed up, but how relevant is it for us as we move forward. So the committee sorted through these 300 responses, and we were able to narrow them down into 3 kind of big buckets. And they took those terms and those buckets back to their departments and grade levels. And they held a meeting with their department or grade level and offered another opportunity for our teaching staff to offer input and reflect on, what is it that we've created? What things do we need to change? What things do we need to modify? Are we moving in the right direction? And really use that as a time to gather more feedback. Following that, the committee came back together and we looked at any of the suggestions that were brought to us, and we used that information then to develop kind of a final draft that would be finished up over the summer. And this process took us about 4 months. So we started at the beginning of February and worked throughout the winter and the spring, and we were able to wrap it up before we left for summer break. So these are some examples of the questions that we used, just different types of things to try and get people thinking about how they teach in their classrooms, and is the quote unquote traditional way, how does that mesh with what we're seeing and hearing about with things like blended learning and personalized learning. How are those terms fitting with what we're trying to do, and do we see a path forward for us as a district? And this is what we came up with. So on the left-hand side, you'll see kind of a statement that we put together early this year, which pulled from the information that you see on the right. So those three big buckets that we came up with were innovative, future ready, and empowered. And we really feel like these are not only important for our students, but also for our teachers as well. So a lot of times we'll use the term learner because we feel like everybody in this system is learning all the time. Whether they're students, teachers, administrators, doesn't matter what role we have, it's part of what we do to continue to learn. So underneath of each of those buckets, you'll see specific terminology. So underneath of innovative, for example, you have personalized, pace, place, and path, variety, voice, reflect, refine, mastery, and investigate. And those were things that we wanted to start to examine more closely as a district. How are we going to work to personalize the learning for our students? What things can we do to offer some flexibility in pace, place, and path? How can we provide more variety? So we're really working at developing, kind of a definition of when we talk about innovative. These are things that we're trying to pursue in our classrooms. So we use this information also when we do goal setting activities. So at the beginning of this school year, our administrators each created goals within those three areas. So each building has a goal in that innovative category, future ready and empowered, about how as a building they're going to work towards those targets that we've laid out as a district. Individual teachers were also asked to use this information when they created their personal goals. And we've got another page I'll show you in just a second that will offer some more context to those terms, and that helped our teachers kind of craft those goals. But then each time we get together for professional development, we try to focus on these as well. So at the beginning of the year with our middle school and high school, we did professional learning that specifically focused on strategies for offering students choice in their learning. We've also done some recently with our middle school staff on the 4 C's, which is part of our future ready strand, and how can we make sure that learning is relevant for our teachers and our students. So part of what we created after we had those key terms listed out is to give more meaning and more context to each of those strands. So we've got future ready, and then we developed an essential question with some members of our teaching staff and our administrators, and then used that again to help us really focus in on what is it we want to see our students doing in the classroom. So we want our learners to be collaborative, to communicate, to think critically and creatively. And this was really directed so that our teachers could see, again, more of an idea of where we're heading as a district, to provide more meaning to that. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a couple of resources, and there's a bit.ly link down in the bottom, so you'll see bit.ly/vision links. These are some different places that we use to kind of help us in the planning process. Kelly asked me last week, what resources did you use as you were coming up with this? And I felt bad because I couldn't come up with them off the top of my head. But so we've got a series of different websites or groups and organizations that were extremely helpful. Education Elements puts out amazing white papers that you just give them your email address and they send you information. On the right-hand side, books and the book Managing Transitions, I actually read after this, but it is excellent. If this is something that you're pursuing in the future in your district, I would highly recommend that managing transitions. We also looked at the LEAP framework, and then maybe most importantly, that there's a school district in Canada called Peel, and they have a document that they've published for their community that really goes into what their vision is for their learners at their school district. And it's amazing. I mean, it's got a lot of great resources in it, and really makes you think about what is possible for our students. It's a really exciting time to be in education, and they've put a lot of work into that document. And then finally, the podcast Modern Learners. Every time I listen to that, I'm really challenged by the information that they share, and it really makes you kind of think about education with a different lens. And through that bit.ly link, you'll see there's direct links to each one of these documents and books and resources. Some takeaways. The first thing I would say is don't rush it. There are times where I wish we had a little bit more time to go back through this and kind of stretch this out and have some more meaningful conversations with our teachers, something like focus groups where we could really drill down to exactly what people were thinking when they responded. I'd also say engage your local resources. If you have a community that's highly involved and really interested in this work, I would get them involved. At one point, we considered using student feedback as well, but the logistics of it we were kind of struggling with. But we felt like we got great responses from our teachers. Start from where you are and use what you already have as a building block. So we started with those mission statements that had been developed by our district and our buildings. And then it doesn't have to be perfect. There are always things that I look back at and I feel like we could change this or we could change that. But I really feel like going through this process, we're in a much better place today than we would have been. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We're better off now than we were before, and that should be the goal. And then avoid trying to guide those responses too much. We really want to create good, solid questions and then let the teachers kind of take it from there, and trust that your questions are going to give you the feedback and give you the information that you're looking for. And with that, Kelly, I think we can open it up to any questions.
Yeah. David, thanks so much for sharing all that info. I know one of the things that people always ask us is, what have other districts done? What have they learned? I always notice that I'm talking with someone and I say, let me tell you what our biggest mistakes were. And then, people always like perk up right away because no one wants to make those mistakes. Anyway, for those of you that have some questions, we've been trying to answer some of those as they've come up. One question, and this came up through the chat window earlier, David, and I'll pass this over to you. What types of questions were the teachers asked when you talked about that process? Yeah,
so I'll bounce back a couple slides here. And
actually,
this.
Let me do that. Do you want me to go back?
Yeah.
I can do it. Okay, there we go.
So we had a question for each of the 5 days throughout this week, and we just posted a question on a whiteboard and then gave teachers post-it notes as they came in, and they responded to these 5 questions. And again, it was really trying to kind of look forward. So what skills do students need to be successful in their next phase of life? That the response you get from an elementary teacher is going to be a lot different than the response that you get from a high school teacher for that. But we really wanted them kind of looking out 2, 3, 5 years. What is it that we want these kids when we, put that stamp on a diploma? What is it that we want that to really mean? So all of these questions were developed with kind of that goal in mind of, here's where we're heading. What do we want it to look like? And then what do we want that to mean for our students as they leave here?
Okay, we've got a couple of questions that have been great from the audience coming in. First, I'm going to get to a question we got from Lindsay. What about, teachers or stakeholders who maybe don't agree with that shared vision? Did you run into that at all? And if you did, how'd you handle that?
Yeah, I think if anybody's honest with you, they're going to say, that not everyone is on board all the time. And we've worked really hard to have one-on-one conversations with those people and really hear what their concerns are. And I just think we have to provide the reason why this is important. And one of the things we've started to do is really share resources, share websites, share articles about what the future for these kids looks like. And you'll see some articles that paint some pretty dire pictures, but there are others that show there is a path forward for these kids, even in a world of automation. But you're always going to have some people who aren't 100% on board. But I think if they understand the reason why the district has made a choice to go in this direction, you're going to limit those concerns. And I think anytime you can have a one-on-one conversation with someone and really figure out exactly what it is that's concerning them, a lot of times it's just a misconception. So we've had a lot, at times we've had things come up where, is online learning the same as blended learning? And we really have to combat that view that we can just stick kids on the computer and that's going to be okay. Right.
Well, it's funny, I was thinking too, we talked about that no through change model. And one of those things on there is, if you're getting resistance, also think about what kind of incentives are in place. And I don't mean like extra pay to come for training. I mean like the incentives in terms of what the, maybe it is the district vision. Maybe it's tied back to something that's a specific part of your school or district improvement plan. In some cases, we've seen districts that have tied some of the work of implementing an LMS into a teacher evaluation process, where let's say you're using a Danielson framework and that gets embedded in there. That can be another kind of incentive. And I love, David, how you pointed out again, once you let people know the why and focus on that and keep that kind of almost like the mission statement that is on all your communication, a constant reminder about why we're doing this, I think it helps to mitigate some of that. Another question we got from Bridget, when starting the transition to an LMS, how long do you think is reasonable for an entire school division? That's a great question. And I think that a lot of that depends on obviously myriad factors. One of those being size. So if you have a district that's, really huge, for example, we're working with LAUSD. Almost don't get bigger than Los Angeles Unified. So you have to think about, how you're going to really pace that out. And if you want to do that and you're rolling it out into certain segments or sections first and then broadening it. I would say, though, that in terms of the research, I brought up that levels of use, kind of graphic from CBAM. In your first year of anything, you probably will get 60 to 70% of your teachers to be at what we would call like mechanical use, meaning that they're still getting used to it and trying to go through the steps they need to implement something. So when you're talking about making their transition to an LMS, if you're talking about long-term change like David's outlining here, that's a multi-year process in terms of impacting learning. So, I would say it depends on size and it depends on kind of what you have in place already. David, what about you? Like for you, what would you say it took for that transition to occur?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that it 100% has occurred yet. And we've been very clear with our staff that this is not a goal for tomorrow. This is not something that we're trying to accomplish this week or even this month. These are steps that we are going to take together over the course of 3 to 5 years that we feel like can really lead to a lasting change, as opposed to it's here and then it's gone and then it just becomes one more of those things that we feel like we started for no reason and then it disappeared. So we're not really focused too closely on how quickly it happens, but we do have kind of that 3 to 5 year range out there.
Yeah. Ryan asked, what's the best way to reboot the why after the program has already begun? You've been at this for a little while. Have you had to like revisit that vision with folks since you've started?
We've had to do a better job of explaining why. I feel like our vision really kind of paints a picture of what this can look like, but it doesn't necessarily explain why we want things to look that way. And we've done some things where we'll share articles with staff members and have discussions on Schoology about how we can use some information that we're getting from the outside world, colleges, universities, workplaces, about what they're seeing and how we can start to incorporate some of those things into our classrooms. But I always feel like we can do a better job of talking about why. I think that's something that most districts could do a better job of.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, we're getting close to running out of time today. I know we've gotten some questions about sharing of slides and the recording. If you are registered for this webinar, you will get something in email that will give you a link to the recording of this. I do want to share our contact info. Both David and I are on Twitter. David is at Dave J. Wallace, and I'm at Kelly80, which is Kelly80, because a lot of people mispronounce my name as Addie. Maybe that's a good way to mitigate that. And then our emails are up there as well. And then, I'll be happy to share, the slides that I shared in terms of the, CBAM and the vision process. I know that was a lot of info, and for those of you who are trying to get that, I'm sure you didn't get it, captured right away. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to send that to you. And then you can also go to schoology.com/demo if you want to see our LMS in action. You can, basically get a feel for what that might look like in terms of your context and ease of use. And also, don't forget, we've got other sessions coming up for the rest of the week. And so one of the things that, obviously we'll be talking out tomorrow is exploring the modern LMS, and that'll be actually featured with El Paso ISD. And then somebody asked the question earlier, what factors do you consider when selecting an LMS? So glad the question came up. We'll actually be talking about that on Wednesday, hearing from Township High School District 211. Day 4, we'll be rolling out the LMS best practices around actual implementation, and that's going to be featuring Troy. And then finally, so you have an LMS, and now what? How do you elevate that instruction? And again, that's going to be a panel of 4 experts that will be kind of guiding you through that conversation. As David said, we really want to thank you for taking your time to spend with us today and looking at setting vision and thinking about that change process. Hopefully you will be tuning in for the rest of this week. And don't forget, use the hashtag LMS Week if you have questions that you want to continue that conversation in our social networking spaces. And don't forget to tag those at Schoology so that we can see those as well. We hope everyone has a great Monday. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you the rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody.